They said we had the most detailed rulebook in the known galaxy, 412 articles, I guess 17 amendments, a supplementary index that took a Velhari legal scholar 11 years to annotate. That, to be fair, Interstellar Compact wasn't just law, it was religion. Every fleet action, every border crossing, every weapons discharge in contested space had to be filed, logged, cross-referenced. Approved by no fewer than 3 oversight committees before anyone so much as raised a shield. We, in my opinion, were proud of that rulebook. We built it after the Keth expansion. Plus, I guess, after what happened at the Dorving corridor. After 3 actually 100 million dead and a generation of silence so deep you could hear it in the way veterans held their cups, 2 hands always, like they were afraid of dropping something they couldn't get back. So when the humans arrived, late, underdocumented flying ships that didn't match any registered hull classification, with a fleet size that didn't appear anywhere in their official disclosure filings, we did what any rational coalition does. We accused them of cheating. We were very confident about this. We called an emergency session. We prepared formal charges. High Commander Veloso himself delivered the opening statement. It was by all accounts a masterwork of diplomatic condemnation. The human representative listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then she smiled, and I have been an officer of the Compact Fleet for 19 years. I have witnessed first contact with 6 species. I have sat across negotiation tables from warlords, pirates, and at least one entity that communicated exclusively in gravitational distortions. I had never before that moment seen a smile that made an entire room of senior military commanders go quiet, not out of offense. Out of something closer to the feeling you get when you're standing at the edge of a very tall thing and you look down and your body understands the height before your mind does. This is what happened in the 3 days that followed. I was basically there for all of it. I logged everything. I always log everything. It's a habit my academy instructor called pathological and I call survival, and I have thought about it every day since. Especially the smile, which especially what was behind it. The first thing I noticed about the human fleet was that it shouldn't have fit. Not physically, though that was also a problem we'd get to, but logistically. The Compact's outer sensor array at threshold marker 9 had logged 43 human vessels passing through the Drail transit corridor over the preceding 48 hours. Standard protocol for coalition partners entering a joint staging area was to submit fleet composition data no less than 72 hours prior to arrival, itemized by vessel class, crew complement, weapons loadout, and mission designation. The humans had submitted documentation for 19 ships. This was, to put it charitably, a discrepancy. I was assigned to the discrepancy at hour 3, which meant by the time I had my uniform sealed and my tablet pulled up, I had approximately 4 minutes of sleep and a headache that had developed its own gravity. My supervisor, Senior Adjutant Feltar, a cascary with 3 eye stalks and a disposition best described as a disappointed librarian, had already been awake for 2 hours and had the specific stillness he got when he was either very calm or extremely furious and hadn't decided which yet. 43, he said when I sat down. I saw. They filed for 19. I know. That is 24 vessels, 24, for which we've no documentation, no designation, no crew manifest, no weapons declaration, and no mission profile. He set his tablet down with the careful precision of someone who wanted to throw it but wouldn't because he was professional, and because he had 3 eye stalks and couldn't afford to look like he was overreacting. This is a violation of Articles 7, 12, 19, 31, and the entirety of Supplement Clause 4. That's a lot of articles. It is the most articles I have personally witnessed violated simultaneously in 19 years of service. He paused. I checked the historical record. It may be a compact record. I pulled up the sensor logs and stared at them. 43 blips, and some of them were big. Not I mean battleship big. The humans didn't fly in those classifications yet, or at least the ones they'd filed documentation for didn't, but there were several in the middleweight range that were reading engines I didn't recognize. Not unregistered. Not quite, I think more like registered under a category that wasn't in our standard identification library. What class is that? I asked, highlighting one of the anomalies. Feltar looked at it for a long time. I have filed an inquiry. The automated classification system returned an error. What kind of errors? The kind that says this vessel type doesn't exist. I stared at the blip. The blip did not seem concerned about this. Get me the human liaison, I said. Her name was Commander Adami, the liaison I mean, and she arrived at the coordination office 40 minutes later wearing a uniform that had clearly been slept in, carrying a beverage that smelled like something had died in it, and she was drinking it anyway as a form of tribute. I had dealt with human liaisons before. The Compact had been in a formal coalition arrangement with the Terran continuance for 8 years. Which wasn't a long time in galactic terms, but was long enough that most of us had developed a working vocabulary of human mannerisms. We understood that humans communicated with their faces in ways that were partly involuntary and mostly alarming. We understood that they considered direct eye contact both polite and aggressive depending on context that was invisible to us. We understood honestly that their response to stress was frequently to make sounds that in our acoustic register would be classified as distress calls, but which they appeared to produce for entertainment. What I had not yet learned was how to read the specific expression Commander Adami wore when she came through the door and saw the sensor readout on the main display. It wasn't alarm. It wasn't guilt. It honestly wasn't even the careful blankness that diplomats wear when they've done something they know they're going to have to explain. It was something closer to the expression my younger cousin makes when she set up a very good joke and she's waiting for the exact moment to deliver it. Well, I logged this. I do kind of not know why I logged it at the time. In retrospect, it was the most important thing I logged that day. Commander Adami, Feltar said, with the tone he reserved for situations where he was going to be very precise about being very displeased. You are aware that your fleet's current composition represents a significant deviation from submitted documentation. She took a long pull from her beverage. 24 vessels are currently unregistered with this command. Approximately, yeah. Approximately, I wrote I mean that down too, which approximately, as if the number of warships in a staging area was a matter of estimation. This constitutes violations of Article 7, 12, 19, 31 and Supplement Clause 4, she said. I'm familiar with the Compact Charter, Senior Adjutant. We were issued a copy when we signed on. Actually, we were issued 6 copies, 3 paper and 3 digital, plus a commemorative edition with a foreword by the council chair. It's very thorough. She set her drink down on the edge of my desk without asking, which was a small thing, but I noted it. We have documentation for the additional vessels. We were going to file it this morning. The filing window closed 72 hours prior to arrival. Right, she looked at him, we know. So you're aware you're in violation. We are aware the documentation is late, yes. That is the same thing. Is it? She tilted her head very slightly. Not a challenge exactly. More like someone asking a genuine question about whether two things that looked identical were actually the same shape. Article 7 specifies pre-arrival filing requirements, yeah, but Article 31 includes a provision for retroactive submission in cases where fleet composition changes were operationally necessitated within the filing window. I'd want to check the exact language, but I believe it's Section 31.4, Subclause B. I had already pulled it up. She was right. It was there. Section 31.4, in my opinion, Subclause B, which allowed for late documentation in cases of, and I'm quoting, operationally significant composition changes arising from active mission parameters. Your fleet composition changed, Feltar said slowly, substantially. In the 72 hours prior to your arrival at this staging area, in the 48 hours prior actually, we can provide the timestamps. Feltar's middle eye stalk did a thing I'd never seen it do. For what it's worth, it folded, just the middle one. The other two stayed level. I didn't know that was physically possible. I logged it actually because I log everything and because it seemed like the kind of thing that shouldn't go unrecorded. What? He said and then stopped and then started again. What operational circumstances resulted in the addition of 24 vessels to your fleet complement in a 48-hour window? Commander Adami picked up her beverage, took another sip, set it back down. We'd have to debrief you properly on that, she said. It's a bit involved. Are you honestly free this afternoon? We were not free that afternoon because High Commander Veloso had called an emergency session. I want to be clear that calling the session was reasonable. From the outside, for what it's worth, from the perspective of every coalition member who wasn't the Terran continuance, the situation looked straightforward. A junior partner had arrived at a joint staging area with more than double their declared fleet strength in unregistered vessel classes. Their liaison's only response was to reference an obscure subclause and suggest scheduling a meeting about it. This looked, in every way that mattered to a coalition that had been built on mutual transparency after the Dorving corridor, like exactly the kind of violation the compact existed to prevent. I understood why Veloso was furious, which I would have been furious. I had only been awake for 3 hours and I was already in a low-level state of outrage that I was managing by very carefully logging everything. The emergency session was held in the Accord Chamber on Level 7 of the Vorath Station Command Ring, a room designed specifically for formal proceedings, with tiered seating, translation fields, and a display array that could render sensor data in 47 visual formats simultaneously. 23 senior officers from 12 coalition species were present. I was there as Feltar's adjutant, which meant I sat in the back row, logged everything, and tried to look like I was taking notes rather than staring at the human delegation. There were 3 of them. Commander Adami, who had finished her terrible beverage and replaced it with an identical terrible beverage. I don't know where she got it. There were no preparation units in the Accord Chamber. She must have brought a reserve, and 2 officers I hadn't been briefed on. One was very tall, with the kind of posture that made you think of load-bearing architecture. The other actually was compact and had a scar over one eye that didn't quite match the surrounding tissue, suggesting it had been repaired in a hurry and nobody had gone back to finish the job properly. They sat at the lower table, the position designated for parties being formally addressed. Veloso opened with the documentation violations and he was thorough, I'll give him that. He walked through every relevant article, cross-reference supplement clause 4, included the censor timestamps and presented the whole thing in a tone that managed to be both clinically precise and deeply personal, like a medical professional delivering a diagnosis they found morally offensive. Commander Adami listened to all of it. She did not interrupt, she did not take notes. Plus, she sat with both hands around her second beverage and listened with the kind of attention that's indistinguishable from patience, except that patience has a bottom to it somewhere, and what she had didn't look like it had a bottom at all. When Veloso finished, and it took 40 minutes, which is a long time even by compact formal proceedings standards, there was a silence. I guess then Commander Adami smiled. I have spent a lot of time thinking about that smile since. I have logged approximately 400 words trying to describe it and deleted all of them. The closest I have gotten is this. It was the smile of someone who was holding all the cards and had decided not to show them yet, not because they were uncertain, but because the timing wasn't right, and they had the patience to wait for the right moment, even if waiting required sitting through 40 minutes of formal accusation while drinking bad coffee. It was also, and I recognize this is not a precise observation, but I'm logging it anyway, a smile that had weight to it. Not the weight I mean of threat, not the weight of challenge. More like the weight of someone who has carried something a long way and has just arrived at the place they were going, and now they're setting the weight down and you suddenly notice how large it was. Hi Commander Veloso, she said. Thank you for the thorough presentation, which I counted 37 article references. That's impressive preparation, she set her cup down. May honestly I ask a question before I respond to the substance of the charges? Veloso, who had been prepared for denial or counterargument, appeared mildly wrong-footed by this. You may. Those 24 vessels your sensors flagged, the unregistered ones, she glanced at the display. Has anyone here identified what they're yet? Silence. A Velhari Admiral Tath Sarovel, I knew her by reputation, 3 campaigns, no patience for ambiguity, leaned forward. Our classification systems returned an error. Right, Adami nodded. They would, we expected that. Those vessels aren't in the compact registry because they don't match any hull class that exists in compact records. She paused. They're new. New, Veloso repeated. Designed and built in the 14 months since the Keth recurrence started, specifically for this basically engagement. She looked around the room. The tall officer behind her was doing something with a tablet. Not nervously, no, that's not the right word. Nothing about the humans in that room was nervous, and I logged this, the absence of nervousness in people who were being formally accused by 23 senior officers. I logged the absence of it because it felt important. He was just scrolling, methodically, the way someone does when they know exactly what they're looking for and they know they've it. The reason they're not documented in your classification library is that they've never been deployed before. Outside of test runs, this is their first operational use. We have the build records, the test run logs, the weapons assessment files, and the operational deployment authorization from Terran Continuance Command. All I guess of it. She nodded to the tall officer. He looked up from his tablet. Sending now, he said. 23 displays in the Accord chamber updated simultaneously. I watched Veloso's face as he read. I want to say I watched it carefully, but honestly I was reading my own copy and it took most of my attention because the file was substantial, and because what it contained required a certain amount of time to process. The short version was this. In the 14 months since the Keth recurrence had begun destabilizing the rimward transit corridors, the Terran Continuance had been running a parallel fleet construction program. Parallel, to be fair, to their formally declared commitments to the Compact. Parallel to their standard military development timeline. They had not publicized it because publication would have alerted Keth intelligence assets to both the program and its scope. The scope was, I looked at the vessel count twice, the scope was substantial. The 19 ships they declared were in fact a scouting advance. A survey element, the fleet that had come through the Drail corridor in the last 48 hours wasn't, as it turned out, the whole of what the Terran Continuance had brought to this engagement. It was, in my opinion, 1/3 of it. I stopped logging for approximately 45 seconds. I can't tell you what I was doing in those 45 seconds, thinking, possibly, and processing. The Compact had been scrambling for 18 months to coordinate a meaningful response to the Keth recurrence and had managed to assemble, with enormous diplomatic effort and 3 emergency funding sessions, a coalition fleet of approximately 90 combat-ready vessels. The humans, I guess, had quietly in 14 months built 131 new ships. Veloso's translator was making a very soft humming sound. I don't know if it was the translator or if it was him, some biological function expressing itself in the absence of words. The Cassiri don't have that, we express stress differently. My left secondary hand was doing a thing where it pressed against my thigh, which it does when I'm trying not to visibly react to something, but I recognized the function of the sound if not its biological origin. These were constructed, Veloso said slowly, in 14 months. Give or take. The compact's standard vessel construction timeline for a heavy combatant is, he stopped, 4 to 6 years depending on the class. Yeah. Commander Adami picked up her cup again. It was empty. She looked at it, seemed to accept this, and set it back down. We work faster when we're motivated. Admiral Tath Sarovel, who had 3 campaigns and no patience for ambiguity, was staring at the specifications on her display. She was very still. The Velhari go still when they're processing something too large for their ordinary thought patterns, the way water goes flat before a wave, and she had gone very, very still. The drive system's kind of on these vessels, she said. I'm not familiar with this configuration. You wouldn't be, it's new. How you know new? 7 months. We've been refining the prototype for 2 years, but the fleet deployment version is 7 months old. It doesn't match any registered propulsion classification. No, it's got about a 30% improvement on approach vector speed over the standard Karath-class drive. Less on honestly long transit, the efficiency drops over distance, but for engagement range she tilted her head, adequate. Adequate, I wrote that down. Plus, in 400 years of compact records, I do not believe anyone had ever described a 30% speed improvement over the most advanced standard drive system in the coalition as adequate. The session lasted another 2 hours. It did not end as a disciplinary proceeding. It ended, I don't think there's a cleaner way to describe this, it ended as a briefing. The humans briefed, I guess, us on what they'd built, what it could do, and why they'd built it in the specific configuration they had, and the room that had assembled to formally charge them with rules violations became, slowly and without any formal transition, a strategy meeting. Commander Adami answered every question and completely. Without hesitation, the files she'd sent covered everything Veloso had accused them of violating, plus several additional fields of documentation that went beyond compact requirements. You were going to file this morning, Feltar said near the end in a tone that was no longer precisely accusatory but hadn't fully decided where it was going. You said the documentation was being prepared. It was done, Adami said. Has been for, in my opinion, 2 weeks. He looked at her. We wanted to have the full fleet in position first, she said. Didn't sort of want to file the documentation and then have the Keth pick it up from a routine compact signal before we were ready to move. She considered something. We should have communicated that reasoning earlier, that's on us. Feltar made a sound, I know this sound. It is the sound he makes when he's been very prepared to be very annoyed at something and has been unexpectedly deprived of the justification. I have made that sound myself. I logged the session in full. I log everything. My academy instructor's exact words were Oracalan. Your compulsive documentation will either save you or get you transferred to archival work, and so far I had avoided archival work, so I considered it a net positive. That night I pulled up the full fleet manifest the humans had submitted and read through it properly. In my opinion, not skimming for violations. To be fair, just reading. 131 vessels, plus new drive systems, weapons configurations I didn't recognize, hull designs that the classification library kept flagging as errors because they didn't fit any existing category. When I looked at why they didn't fit, when I actually examined the structural designs, I began to understand that they hadn't been designed to fit existing categories. They'd been designed for something else. I pulled up the tactical assessment file, read it twice, then I sat back and my left secondary hand did the thing on my thigh again, and I thought about the smile. Not the smile like someone who had been caught and gotten away with it. Not the smile pretty much of someone who had been clever. Something else, plus, well, something more like what my grandmother used to call Velkesh, which doesn't translate cleanly, but it roughly means the calm of knowing exactly where you stand even when the ground looks uncertain. We had accused them of hiding their fleet. They had been hiding their fleet. Those 2 facts I was beginning to realize were not as simply connected as I had assumed. The question, the one I wrote at the bottom of my log that night and underlined twice, wasn't why were they hiding it. The question was, what were they planning to do with it? I know this because by Cycle 8 I had been assigned as the primary compact liaison to the human delegation, a role that Feltar explained to me with the specific tone of someone doing you a favor that will also be terrible for you, and which required that I attend the morning coordination briefings the human delegation held before the joint sessions. The morning briefings were in a converted equipment bay on the port side of Voreth Station that the humans had requisitioned on arrival and promptly made unrecognizable. There were map overlays on 3 walls, which was normal. There were nutrient schedules and rest rotation charts, which were also normal if unusually detailed. There was a communication array that had more active channels than our standard fleet command setup, which I noted and wouldn't again later. And in the corner, on a surface that had previously held atmospheric processing equipment and now held a collection of personal items that bore no tactical relevance whatsoever, there was a small heating unit dedicated entirely to producing coffee. I know what coffee is. 8 years of Compact Continuance Coalition work means every officer above Adjutant 3rd grade has attended a cultural orientation that covers human dietary practices, including the information that humans consume at scale, a heated beverage made from the processed seeds of a plant, which contains a compound that acts as a stimulant on their neurochemistry. The orientation materials describe it as mildly bitter and universally consumed across human cultures. The orientation materials did not adequately convey the smell. It wasn't a bad smell precisely. It was a very present smell. It arrived before anything else did and had the quality of a statement, the way a Cascari scent mark announces territory, but warmer, less aggressive, more like announcement as invitation. Pretty much something is happening here. For what it's worth, come find out. Commander Adami poured me a cup on my second morning there without asking and set it in front of me on the briefing table. I can't metabolize this, I said. I know, smell it though. You know, I did not smell it, I looked at it instead. It was dark and had the surface texture of deep space in an area with no nearby stars, flat, absorptive, self-contained. It sat in the cup with a certain confidence. Right, said Adami and moved on. The other two humans in the delegation were Lieutenant Commander Ferreira and Senior Operative Noak, and I learned things about them over the course of Cycle 8 that I had not been briefed on. Ferreira was the tall one. He had the kind of build that made you recalculate your estimates of human physical capability, not dramatically, not in a way I could quantify easily, but in the way that objects sometimes look larger when you understand their actual weight. He spoke rarely in briefings, but when he did, the room tended to reorient toward him in a way that seemed involuntary, not because he was louder than the others, because he was very precise. Where Adami operated in a register that was measured but fluid, leaving space around her words, Ferreira cut to the exact point and stopped. No excess, which every sentence load-bearing. Noak was the compact one with the inadequately repaired scar. She appeared to operate on a different attentional frequency from most people I had encountered. She was constantly aware of things I wasn't, not in a way that was performed, just in the specific pattern of where her eyes moved, what she picked up and set back down, which parts of a briefing she was actually listening to versus processing in a way that looked like not listening. She and Ferreira communicated without words in a manner that I logged several times without being able to fully decode it. A glance that meant something, a small motion of the hand. Once, in a joint session that was going poorly, Ferreira had moved the position of a stylus on the table by approximately 2 centimeters, and Noak, without looking at him, had sat back in her chair and stopped arguing a point she was clearly winning. I think know what that meant. I logged it. What's your read on the Velhari delegation? Adami asked me on the morning of Cycle 8 in the first 5 minutes of the briefing before I had been given any indication that my read was something being solicited. I looked at her. Plus, I'm here as a liaison, my function. Coordination and documentation. Yeah, I read your assignment brief. She had both hands around her coffee cup, which I was starting to understand was a default state rather than a signal. I'm asking, as you know, a colleague, Tath Sarovel, what's her disposition toward the new fleet configuration? I considered this. It wasn't, strictly speaking, a question I was authorized to answer. On the other hand, it was also not a question that was obviously inappropriate. It was the kind of situational intelligence that any coalition partner might reasonably want before a joint tactical session. Skeptical, I said, of the drive systems in particular, which she's concerns about integration with existing fleet protocols. Good concerns or bad concerns? Technically well-founded. She wants to see test-run data from the new vessels operating in mixed formation with Velhari wing configuration, which I stopped. Which we've, Adami said, 12 months of it. You in mixed formation with Velhari wing configuration. Yeah, we've been running simulations against their standard protocols for 8 months. We'd have started sooner, but we didn't get the classified Velhari formation specs until we made a specific request through the diplomatic channel, and that took 4 months. She took a sip of coffee. Send her the, to be fair, data before the afternoon session. You'll want her technical staff to have time to review it. I stared at the surface of my untouched cup for a moment. It still smelled like announcement as invitation, which you prepared for the Velhari integration question, I said, before arriving. Before we left port. Yeah. You anticipated Admiral Tath Sarovel's specific technical concern about mixed formation operations. We anticipated that somebody would have it. She shrugged, a human gesture I had documented as expressing casual acknowledgement of something considered self-evident. It's a reasonable concern. We'd have, for what it's worth, had it too. I sent the data to Tath Sarovel's technical staff. I also, while I was at it, pulled up the communication array in the corner of the briefing room and counted the active channels. 47, and our standard fleet command setup for a staging area this size ran 12 to 16, depending on the operation. 47 wasn't a communications array for a delegation of 3. It was a communications array for a command center. I was looking at it from an angle that showed me the traffic indicators, which channels were active, which were high bandwidth, and the pattern I saw wasn't a coalition partner coordinating a small delegation. It, I guess, was something being directed. I did not ask about it, I noted it, which is different. Asking would have been premature and the sort of thing that, if I was wrong about what I was seeing, would make me look like I'd been spooked by a large communications rig. I logged it and added a flag to follow up. The afternoon joint session was about force deployment. The Keth recurrence, which had started as 3 isolated incursions in the rimward corridors, and had been for 18 months persistently described by Compact Command as manageable and contained, had in the 2 weeks prior to this staging operation stopped being manageable and contained in a way that was visible to anyone with access to sensor data above clearance level 3. The transit routes were being systematically pressured. Not with the mass formation attacks that the Keth had used in the previous conflict, the one that had produced the Dorving corridor and the rulebook and the veterans with the two-handed grip on their cups, but with something more patient, more structured, which Admiral Tath Sarovel had produced a threat assessment that was, in its way, one of the more elegant documents of controlled panic I had ever read. Every projection was precise, and every confidence interval was appropriately hedged. And every scenario above baseline probability ended with the same projected outcome. The compact coalition as currently constituted did not have the force concentration to prevent the main transit nodes from being compromised. This was the strategic situation when Ferreira stood up. He didn't, ask to stand. He didn't signal for the floor. He simply stood in the pause after Tath Sarovel finished presenting and placed a secondary display next to the main threat projection. "May I," he said, which was a request in form but not entirely in substance because he had already started the display. The Velhari admiral looked at him with the particular stillness she was apparently capable of sustaining indefinitely. Then she gestured for him to continue. What Ferreira had produced was a counterforce map. It took the Keth distribution model from the threat assessment, their projected positions, their movement patterns, the systemic pressure points they were applying to the transit nodes, and overlaid a fleet deployment model. Not for what it's worth, the compact fleet is currently constituted. The fleet that had come through the Drail corridor, to be fair, all of it. The full 131 vessels, plus the compact coalition forces. Plus, and here was the part of the display that I noticed Tath Sarovel notice, her stillness shifting into a different quality of stillness, a second wave. Ferreira hadn't mentioned a second wave, and what, said Tath Sarovel, is this? Ferreira pointed at the display. That's our reserve commitment. 70 additional vessels, transitready, currently positioned at relay point 7 in the Grath corridor. They can be at the staging area in 16 hours on request. The room absorbed this. 70 additional vessels, Veloso said slowly. Plus what's here, yes. Ferreira's tone was the same as if he were describing maintenance schedules. We wanted to have them positioned before we filed the deployment request. Didn't want to request permission to move them and then have the movement tracked before they reach staging. You wanted to have them positioned, Veloso said, before filing the request for permission to move them. Operationally, it makes sense. It doesn't make sense within compact protocols. No, Ferreira agreed, it doesn't. We'll accept the article citation on that one, but they're in position now, and if you want them at the table for this conversation, they can be here by end of cycle 9. I was doing the math very quietly in my head, the way I do when I want to make sure I'm not misreading a number. The compact coalition fleet for this operation, approximately 90 vessels. The human fleet that had arrived, 131. The reserve commitment at relay point 7, 70. Total Terran continuance contribution to this joint operation if the reserve was activated, 201 vessels. Against TBH, the compact coalition's 90, and the humans, who had been the junior coalition partner for 8 years, had arrived for a joint operation with more than twice the fleet strength of the entire rest of the coalition combined. I looked at the display. I looked at Adami, who was sitting at the briefing table with her coffee and her expression that had the same weight it had had in the Accord chamber. I looked at the communication array back in the corner of the portside equipment bay, with its 47 active channels, and I thought about what kind of operation those 47 channels were coordinating. Not a delegation, not like even a fleet command. A theater command and the humans had arrived to a joint operation, and they had quietly, methodically, without announcement, brought enough force that they could run the entire operation unilaterally if they chose to. And they had done this while filing as a junior partner, while sitting at the lower table, while accepting citations for documentation violations and smiling and asking politely when they could present the evidence they'd had prepared for weeks. Veloso was looking at Adami. "Commander," he said, "I need to ask you directly, which was this the plan from the beginning?" She considered this for a moment with the same quality of consideration she'd been applying to everything, unhurried, entirely present, like she was actually thinking about the question rather than preparing a diplomatic response to it. We assessed the threat profile, she said. We assessed what the compact would realistically be able to commit. We built to what the situation required. She set down her cup. We weren't hiding it from you because we were planning something against the coalition's interests. We were like managing it because we didn't want the Keth to know the commitment before we were ready. And now you're ready. Now we're ready. Tath Sarovel, who had 3 campaigns and no patience for ambiguity and who had gone through 2 registers of stillness already in this session, said, "What exactly are you proposing?" Ferreira adjusted the display. The counterforce map resolved into an operational plan. 5 phases, clean lines of engagement. Transit node protection integrated with forward pressure on the Keth distribution pattern in a way that would, if it worked, not just defend the existing corridors but actively disrupt the systematic pressure strategy the Keth had been running for 18 months. It wasn't a defensive operation, it was a solution. Phase 1, to be fair, begins in 48 hours, Ferreira said. Assuming the coalition commits, plus we can adjust timelines if needed, but the optimal window for Phase 2 is Cycle 10. You've had this planned, Tath Sarovel said. We've had options developed. This is the one that fits the current threat profile. How long have you been developing options? Ferreira considered. Which ones do I mean you want the timeline for? It wasn't a deflection, it was a genuine question, plus the kind that implies the answer might require specifying which among several applicable responses you wanted because there were several. I guess wrote very carefully in my log they planned for this, not this situation specifically. For actually situations like this, whatever this is, it's not improvised. The session ran late. Plus, after it in the corridor outside the Accord chamber, Noak fell into step beside me without any particular indication that she intended to do this. You log a lot, she said. I looked at her. It's my function. Sure, she walked in silence for a few steps. She had a way of moving that covered ground efficiently without appearing to be in a hurry. You counted the comm channels this morning. This wasn't a question. I count things, I said. Habit. What was your count? 47 active. She nodded. 49 now, which we brought the relay .7 element into the network once the deployment announcement was cleared. She glanced at me, not the glance that preceded a statement, the glance that preceded a question. Does that bother you? I thought about this honestly. Should it? Probably not, she shrugged, and we're coalition partners. What we run in our own comms isn't really compact business unless it's a security concern. Another few steps. I'm telling you so you stop wondering. I had been wondering. What are you coordinating? I said. With 49 channels. I think. She looked at the middle distance for a moment with an expression that wasn't evasive exactly but that I catalogued as considering how much of a real answer to give. The fleet, she said, and some other things. What other things? Things that will be in the documentation. She glanced at me again. All of it will be in the documentation. We're not running anything outside the compact framework. We're just running it in a specific order. Asset positioning before filing, plus documentation before deployment, some things before other things. That is a very precise description of doing things without authorization, I said. She smiled. It was a different smile than Adami's. Smaller and less weight setting down, more the expression of someone who had just confirmed a hypothesis. It's a very precise description of doing things before filing the authorization, she said, which isn't the same thing. I thought about Section 31.4. Subclause B, operationally significant composition changes arising from active mission parameters. You've read the compact charter thoroughly, I said. We've read it thoroughly, she agreed. We had 4 months on the transit to relay .7. We had time. I stopped walking. She took 2 more steps and then stopped as well, not turning immediately in the way of someone who expected this. At the start of this, I said, to be fair, when you arrived, when we were already calling sessions and running article citations, you weren't surprised. No. You expected it. We expected the process, yeah. She finally turned. Look, for what it's worth, the outside, we look like a coalition partner who showed up with twice the declared force strength and then cited subclause B. I understand why that triggered the session. I'd have triggered the session. She looked at me steadily. We weren't offended by the process. The process exists for good reasons, and we also knew we had the documentation and the legal basis and the operational justification. So we sat through the session. The smile, I said, and then immediately wasn't sure why I said it. But she knew what I meant, which Adami's been waiting for this operation for 14 months, Noak said. Building it, running projections, which arguing for the resource commitment through 6 different budget cycles back home. The session was, she paused. You spend a year building something and then you get to show it. There's a thing that happens. She touched the inadequately repaired scar over her eye briefly, the way you touch something reflexively. We called it right, the threat, the scale, the approach. We got here and the threat profile matched our projections and the fleet was in position. She turned to walk again. The smile wasn't about the citations, which it was about being right. I stood in the corridor for a moment after she turned. 49 comm channels, a reserve fleet at relay point 7, plus an operational plan in 5 phases with an optimal window on cycle 10. I thought about the Dorving corridor. I thought about the veterans and their two-handed grip. I thought about 412 articles and 17 amendments and why we built the rulebook in the first place, because something had gone wrong in a way that couldn't be undone, and the only response we had was to build a structure that would prevent it from happening again. And I thought about the humans who had also built a structure, like just a different kind. I went back to my office and logged the conversation in full. Then I sat for a long time looking at the notation I'd made the previous night. What were they planning to do with it? I had a partial answer now and the question underneath it, the one I added to my log with a second line underneath, and this time no attempt to answer it, was the one I kept arriving at from every direction. What do they think is coming? Which the answer to what do they think is coming arrived at hour 2 on cycle 9, which is when I finished reading the threat assessment file. Not the one Tath Sorovel had presented in the afternoon session. That one I had read, which this was a different file, the one attached to the human operational plan, in the appendix that most people hadn't got to yet because it was labeled supporting analysis, predictive modeling, tertiary probability scenarios, which is exactly the kind of label designed to make you think you don't need to read it. I read it because I read everything. My academy instructor called it pathological. I called it the reason I was still employed. The Compact's threat assessment treated the Keth recurrence as a pressure campaign, a systematic testing of coalition response time and force concentration. The implicit assumption laid out in Tath Sorovel's projections embedded in every deployment model we'd been working from for 18 months was that the Keth were probing for weak points, looking for corridors they could take and hold. Trying to reshape pretty much the transit network in their favor through incremental pressure. This was a reasonable interpretation of the available data. I had believed it myself. The human tertiary scenario appendix started from the same data and arrived somewhere else entirely. The argument laid out in 12 pages of density I read twice to be sure I was following it correctly was this: the Keth pressure campaign wasn't looking for weak points, it was creating them, systematically. The transit disruptions weren't probes, they were preparation. The 18 months of incremental pressure was a slow compression of coalition force distribution, pulling response elements toward the nodes under pressure, thinning coverage elsewhere, establishing a pattern of engagement that the Keth would know by rote by the time the actual strike came, because there was an actual strike coming. The TBH appendix had a projected timeline. And the confidence interval on the timeline was wide enough that I didn't initially understand why they were publishing it at all. A 30-week window isn't a timeline, it's a general season, but I kept reading and I found the section that explained the reasoning. And then I sat back, and my left secondary hand found my thigh and I read it a third time. The transit node at Keth Proximity Relay Station Meridian had been showing intermittent communications interference for 6 weeks. The Compact had logged it, filed it I think under maintenance anomalies. Plus the honestly interference pattern wasn't consistent with equipment failure, it was consistent with a Keth deep system relay network operating at the edge of detection range. The humans had noticed this 7 weeks ago. They had noted it, built it into their projection models, and then here was the part I read. A third look, time gone back through the Compact sensor archive, looking for earlier instances of the same pattern. They had found 17 separate instances pretty much of the same anomalous interference signature, distributed across the Rimward corridor network, spanning 14 months, all of which the Compact had logged as maintenance anomalies. The Keth, in my opinion, had been installing a communications network inside our sensor coverage zone for over a year. Not a combat network, which a coordination network. The kind of infrastructure you build when you're planning to move a very large number of assets in a very specific sequence, and you need them to be in communication during the process. The kind you build when you're planning not a pressure campaign but an offensive. I calculated, with my tablets and my professional composure and my left secondary hand pressing against my leg, the approximate date range that corresponded to the end of the projected timeline. It was 6 weeks away. I sent a priority communication to Feltar at hour 3. He called me back in 4 minutes, which is, in my experience of Feltar's response times, essentially instantaneous. "You read the appendix," he said. "You read the appendix," I said. His middle eye stalk did the fold thing again. "I read it an hour ago. I'm waiting for Velasso's confirmation that it's been passed to the High Command Analysis Team." "Does Velasso?" "He's reading it now." Feltar's voice had a quality I couldn't immediately classify, not alarm, not its opposite, something more like a recalibration happening in real time, the sound of a very careful person rapidly revising a very large number of assumptions. The humans built the fleet for this, he said, not a question. Yes. They've known about this projection for how long? The appendix dates show the primary analysis was completed 4 months ago. I paused. But honestly, the supporting data goes back 7 months. They've been building the fleet for 14 months. Silence on the channel. I could hear his translation field making its slight low hum. They started building the fleet, he said slowly, 3 months before they completed the analysis. That justified the fleet. Yes, how? Best current guess, I said, is they trusted the trajectory before they had the model to explain it. Another silence, kind of longer. That is not how threat assessment works, Feltar said. No, I agreed, which it isn't. At hour 9, Commander Adami came to my office. She didn't announce herself. She knocked. Humans knock. It's a physical notification system. They use the structure of a door as a communication device. I had been briefed on this, but it still registered as slightly startling every time. When I said she could enter, she came in, looked at the 3 open files on my display, and sat down in the chair across from my desk without being invited. She did not have coffee. This was the first time I had seen her without coffee, and I noted it because I note things. You read the appendix, she said. Everyone is reading the appendix this morning, I said. Yeah. She looked at the display. And how long did it take you to get from the interference signature analysis to the fleet timeline? About 40 minutes. I went back through it twice. We took 3 days when we first ran it. She rubbed the side of her face. Gesture I had by now identified as indicating fatigue or cognitive density, distinct from the I touch Noak used for something else. We kept not believing the output, kept trying to find the error in the model. And, there sent one, she said it flat, not resigned exactly. Resignation implies acceptance of a bad situation, and she didn't have the quality of acceptance about her. More like the clarity of someone who has finished arguing with a conclusion and is now working with it. The compact analysis team will run it clean too. Tath Sarovel's people basically will probably get their fastest, they're good, 48 hours, and everyone will have the same picture weave. Which is why Phase 1 starts in 48 hours. She looked at me. You're not trying to get ahead of the Keth recurrence, I said. You're trying to get into position before the main offensive. The 5-phase plan isn't a response to the pressure campaign, it's a preemption of the strike. The two things are connected, she said. If we address the pressure nodes first, we pull the Keth distribution out of the compression pattern. Change the conditions the main offensive is designed to exploit. She leaned back. It's like there's a human thing called changing the board. If someone sets up a position over many moves to force a specific outcome, the defense isn't to wait for the forced move. You change the board so the forced move no longer leads where it's supposed to. And your fleet, I said, is how you change the board. Yeah, I looked at my display. The interface pattern, the timing, the reserve element at relay point 7. 201 vessels positioned to execute a 5-phase operation that predated the formal accusation session by months. The documentation, I guess, ready to file. The comm network operational. The reserve brief to be fair and transitory. Plus, you were going to do this regardless, I said, like, of the coalition session, of the article citations, which of Velasso's presentation. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, she chose her words with the care of someone who was being accurate, not diplomatic. We were going to do this in alignment with the coalition. We were always going to do it in the coalition framework. We just weren't going to let the process stop the operational timeline. She met my eyes. The compact charter has provisions for this. It's not a clean fit, but it's there. Article 31.4b, the operational necessity clause. The spirit of the compact is mutual defense with mutual transparency. We provided the transparency on the timeline, we could provide it safely. The defense, she tilted her head, the defense was already in motion. And if the coalition had said no, at the session, if Velasso had ruled the violations material and ordered your fleet held pending a formal review. A pause. That didn't happen, she said. No, I agreed, but if it had. She looked at the wall. The sensor overlays, I guess, the deployment maps, the 47-49 channels of something being directed from a port-side equipment bay. We, I guess, would have requested an urgent review on an expedited timeline, she said, presented the appendix as emergency evidence, pushed for the fastest possible resolution. Another pause. And if that failed, we would have had a very difficult conversation about what the coalition framework means when the framework's timeline doesn't fit the threat timeline. I logged this, all of it, including the pause. You built that fleet, I said, with no guarantee the coalition would accept it. We built that fleet because the threat required it and nobody else was building it. She looked back at me, not challenging and not apologetic, just steady. Look, I know kind of how this reads. I know what I mean. Looks like we went around the process, but the process exists to protect against betrayal and miscalculation. We weren't committing either. She stood. The compact charter is a tool. It's a very good tool. It was built by species that understood the cost of getting this wrong. She straightened her uniform, which was, as always, slightly rumpled in the way of something that had been correct once and had since been subjected to continuous use. We also understood the cost of getting this wrong, and we had better information about the timeline. She walked to the door, stopped. The appendix has a section at the end, she said. The one after the timeline, you get TBH to it. I read to page 12. There's a page 13, she left. I pulled the appendix back up. Page 13 was short, half a page. It wasn't analysis. It was a note written based on the timestamp in the transit from Relay Point 7 to the Drail corridor in the 2-day window before the advance fleet came through. It was addressed to no one specifically, which is how you write something you know other people will eventually read. It said in the flat declarative style of someone who writes threat assessments for a living and has run out of professional distance. If this analysis is correct, the Keth main offensive will begin before this operation concludes. We won't be in a position to choose whether to engage on their timeline. We will only be in a position to choose whether we're ready. We chose to be ready. We recognize this created complications with coalition process. We believe those complications are resolvable, which we believe the threat timeline is not. If we're wrong about the analysis, we accept the consequences, institutional, diplomatic, and legal, and will stand in front of whatever review board the compact requires. If we're right, we ask only that the coalition evaluate our conduct on the basis of what we built and what it was for. Either way, the fleet is here. I sat with that for a long time. The Keth communications signature at Relay Station Meridian went active at hour 14 on cycle 9, not the interference pattern. The actual network, broadcasting openly, which is what a coordination network does when the operation it's coordinating has begun. I was in the Joint Operations Center when the sensor alert came in. I was there because I had started being there, not because it was my assignment. My assignment was documentation and liaison work. The information density in the operations center was where the story was and I needed to see it, which was a failure of professional objectivity I would evaluate later. The alert came in at the same second on 16 different feeds. Tath Sarovel was at the main display in under 4 minutes, Vel also in 6. Plus Operations Center went from its cycle 9 hour 14 standard activity level to full alert status in the kind of organized controlled rush that looks like chaos until you've watched it enough times to see the structure in it. The first Keth forward elements were detected 11 minutes after the network went active. Not at the like pressure nodes, not at the rimward corridors the previous 18 months had been spent stressing, at Relay Station Meridian. And at Threshold Gateway Vorath, which the station we were on. I won't pretend that I processed this with professional composure. My left secondary hand did the thigh thing, both of them actually. A biological stress response I documented later for completeness. What I observed in the following 7 minutes, the compact coalition fleet began scramble protocols which were orderly and which took time. The human fleet went to engagement configuration, which was faster, in a way that I watched on the sensor display with a very focused quality of attention because they had clearly prepared for this more extensively than scramble protocols accounted for. Not just maintained readiness and prepared for this. This position, this geometry, the reserve element sort of at Relay Point 7 was already in transit had been. Since hour 7, before the network went active, before the sensors confirmed what page 13 had been telling us all week, Ferrer appeared in the operations center at hour 14 plus 9 minutes, moving with the unhurried architecture of a load-bearing thing that had decided what it was doing. We're initiating phase 1, he said, addressing Velasso directly. I'm requesting coalition authorization for joint engagement. Velasso, to his considerable credit, did not hesitate. Granted. Like Ferrer looked at Tath Sarovel, Admiral, I'm sending you integration protocols for the mixed formation element, your Wing 4 and our Vanguard group. He was already moving to the operations console. The data package your technical staff reviewed yesterday were running configuration B. She had gone to her stillness. The third kind I thought, not processing, not recalibrating, decided, configuration B, she confirmed, my Wing 4 is yours. He moved, plus the display updated. The integration configuration from 12 months of simulation locked into place in the real-time engagement map with a smoothness that, in my experience of field operations, simulations do not usually achieve. To be fair, looked for Adami in the operations center and did not find her. I looked at the communication traffic indicators and found 49 channels processing at maximum capacity. I thought about the portside equipment bay and the dark coffee and the map overlays on 3 walls. I thought about the smile, the weight of it. The set-it-down quality, 14 months of building and projecting and arguing through 6 budget cycles, and here now the moment the board changed. Outside, I guess, the viewport, a 3-meter display screen running real-time sensor feed. The Keth forward elements were resolving out of the sensor noise into defined shapes, more of them than I wanted to count. More than Tath Sarovel's threat assessment had projected as baseline probability. Her assessment, I remembered, was technically well-founded. Her confidence intervals were appropriately hedged. The human appendix had a different number. The number I could see on the sensor display looked more like the appendix. Ferreira, at the operations console, said something to the comm without raising his voice. The reserve element from Relay Point 7 appeared on the engagement map, transit complete, sliding into their pre-designated position with the choreography of something that had been rehearsed, not improvised. I opened my log. I started a new entry at hour 14, cycle 9. I typed, they were right about the timeline. Then I stopped typing and watched. I want to write that in the way that conveys what 11 hours means in operational terms, not as a duration but as a weight. Every command-level engagement I had been through before this one had a beginning and a middle and something that could be recognized in the moment as an end. There's usually a point where the sensor data changes in a way that tells the room what has happened. A decisive action, plus a retreat, a collapse. This didn't have that structure. It had phases because the humans had written phases and the phases held, which was its own kind of astonishing. I have been in operations where the plan survived first contact with the enemy and they rent the default, but within the phases it was less battle than correction. Like watching someone reset a very large machine that had been running wrong for a long time. The Keth forward elements hit threshold gateway Vorath on the geometry they had prepared for. Compact response distribution thinned by 18 months of pressure, coalition forces pulled toward the rimward nodes, the coordination network guiding their strike timing to the window where the board was compressed in their favor. Except the board had already changed. The Human Vanguard Group and Tath Sorovel's Wing 4 Configuration B, 12 months of simulation. A data package reviewed by Velhari technical staff the previous afternoon, were positioned at the gateway approach in a formation that did not exist in any Keth assessment of compact defensive posture, because it had not existed 48 hours ago. The Velhari wing configuration was precise, powerful, and known. The Human Vanguard drove through the middle of what the Keth had mapped as the coverage gap. There kind of was no coverage gap anymore. I honestly watched this on the sensor display. I watched it the way you watch something that's confirming something you were already told and still doesn't feel real until you see it. The Keth forward formation made contact with the integrated response, and the tactical geometry they had spent 14 months preparing for simply didn't apply. Not because it was countered, and because the positions it assumed weren't there. Ferreira at the operations console made adjustments, not reactive adjustments, not oh sort of here's what they're doing let me respond adjustments. The kind that come from a model you built 7 months ago and tested against 12 probability variants and already have contingency protocols for. He was 4 moves ahead and looked, doing it, about as tense as someone conducting an inventory. Veloso was watching him. I logged this, the High Commander of the Compact Coalition Fleet, watching the human tactical officer with an expression I had no species-specific framework for, in which my best approximation would be, I need to understand how this is happening. At hour 3 of the engagement, the Keth main body arrived. This was the part of the appendix that Tath Sorovel's threat assessment had gotten wrong. Not her fault tbh, the available data had supported a smaller projection. The appendix sort of had used the same data and the same analytical methodology and arrived at a number that was, looking at the sensor display at hour 3, clearly the more accurate one. The main body was large. The kind of large that has a gravitational quality to it, where you look at the sensor cluster and your mind slightly refuses to process the count. I started to count and got to a number and then looked at the reserve element from Relay Point 7, 70 vessels, now fully integrated into the coalition engagement map, running their own operational channel alongside 47 compact network channels, and the math wasn't comfortable, but it was better than the math had looked this time yesterday. The Joint Operations Center was very loud. Every translation field working at capacity because 12 species were talking simultaneously and some of them were species. That expressed tactical stress with involuntary vocalization and some of them, Cassiri included, do not, and the room was a sonic register of both at once. I was logging and tracking and relaying documentation requests from Feltar, who was 3 decks up managing administrative operations and sending me queries at a rate that implied he was also not comfortable but was expressing it through documentation requests. Adami found me at hour 4. Kind of she had coffee. I do not know how she had coffee during an active fleet engagement. I logged it because I log things. Phase 3, she said instead of hello, looking at the display. We're initiating the Keth distribution disruption sequence. The deep network nodes, I said. Yeah, if we can take the coordination network offline, the main body loses the timing synchronization the whole offensive is built around. She looked at me. It's a surgical operation, small fast vessels, specific nodes in and out. She paused. Noak is running it. I looked at the display, found the element she was describing, 12 vessels, fast-rated, peeling away from the main engagement geometry on a heading toward the Keth coordination network relay positions the appendix had mapped. Noak, the compact human with the inadequately repaired scar. who communicated with Ferreira without words, who counted active channels and told me things would be in the documentation. She volunteered, Ademi said, which I had not asked. And you let her. A pause. She's the best weave for this kind of operation. Another pause. Yes, I let her. I thought about the scar, about tissue repaired in a hurry and never finished properly, about some prior operation that had gone close enough that the mark was still there. I thought about Ademi's expression when she said she's the best weave for this. How dangerous is the network disruption operation, I said. Manageable, she said in the tone of someone who has said this word a specific number of times and understands exactly what it costs to say it. I did not push further. I logged it the way I log things when I don't want to look at them directly, factually in the third person without inference. At hour 4 cycle 10, Commander Ademi confirmed Phase 3 network disruption operation under Senior Operative Noak's command, 12 vessel element targeting Keth relay infrastructure. Commander Ademi described the operation as manageable, plus the relay network started going dark at hour 6, basically node by node. Not simultaneously, that wasn't the method, but sequentially in the specific order the appendix had identified as the architectural vulnerability of the Keth coordination system. If you took the relay nodes in the wrong order, the network could route around the disruption. In the right order, each loss cascaded, the timing windows closed. The synchronization degraded. The thing that had taken 14 months to build started coming apart the way complex systems come apart when the right connection is severed, not dramatically, not all at once but irreversibly. On the main engagement display, the Keth main body's formation began to lose coherence at hour 7. Tath Sarovel called it before Ferreira did. She had more experience reading Keth tactical behavior at operational scale, and she was watching for the sign of it. She said in a voice that was still precise and was also something else. They're responding to the network loss. Tactical cohesion, I think, is degrading in the outer elements. She was very still. The fourth kind, I thought, plus the kind after decided. The kind that comes after you've watched the thing you projected happen and you're processing the sensation of having been right about something that mattered. Phase 4 window is open. Ferreira moved. Phase 4 was the part of the operational plan that Veloso had questioned most heavily in the session, because it was aggressive in a way that required the compact coalition forces to move toward the Keth main body rather than maintaining the defensive geometry. He had pointed out accurately that if the Phase 3 disruption didn't achieve the projected degradation, the Phase 4 advance would be badly exposed. Ferreira had said, "We've built in decision points. If the disruption metrics at hour 6 don't hit threshold, we hold Phase 4. The hour 6 metrics had hit threshold, which the coalition advance began. I watched it on the display, and I watched Veloso watch it, and I watched the High Commander of the Compact Fleet, who had built a career on the careful administration of multilateral military protocols, on the maintenance of the 412 article framework that kept the coalition from becoming a collection of unilateral actors with aligned interests and divergent methods. I watched him watch the engagement map, and I couldn't read his expression with any certainty. But my best attempt was something like, I'm watching something I don't fully understand when, and I'm deciding how to feel about that. At hour 8, 2 of the 12 Phase 3 vessels came back damaged. One of them was badly damaged. I watched it limp through the tactical display, reduced to 30% propulsion, running on secondary systems. The name on the registry tag was TCS Endurance, which I noted in a way that felt accidentally appropriate. Noak's vessel came back at hour 8 plus 20 minutes, not damaged, running full systems. I was watching the display when Ademi made a brief small sound, not words, not anything with content, just a single exhale that had a shape to it. I did not look at her. I looked at, I guess, the display. She had set her coffee down and she had not picked it back up. The last Keth coordination relay went dark at hour 9. By hour 11 it was over, or it was over in the ways that a sensor display can show you. The Keth main body was in retreat, not dissolution, not rout, but the specific geometry of a force that has been tactically disrupted and has made a rational assessment about the cost of continuing. They withdrew to the positions they'd held before the recurrence started, maybe beyond. The rimward corridors were clear. The pressure nodes were clear, and the transit network, which had been compressing for 18 months, decompressed in the hours after hour 11 as the Keth relay infrastructure came offline and the operational architecture of the campaign lost its coordination backbone. Without the network, the distributed pressure became isolated positions. Without the timing synchronization, the 18 months of careful preparation became just ships that were somewhere they hadn't been before the recurrence started. Manageable, containable, solvable by normal coalition protocols. I wrote this TBH down. I wrote down the end of the engagement, the preliminary casualty figures, the phase completion timestamps, the network disruption confirmation, the Keth withdrawal vectors. I guess wrote down everything because writing things down is how I have for 19 years made events real, how I hold onto what happened long enough to understand it. At hour 14, after the post-engagement brief, Veloso asked to speak with Commander Ademi privately. I wasn't in that meeting, which I wasn't supposed to know about it. I know about for what it's worth, it because Feltar told me because Feltar knows about everything, which is why he is a senior adjutant and I'm still a regular one. What I was told about the meeting is this. Veloso asked Adami plainly and without preamble how long the Terran continuance had been developing the predictive modeling framework that produced the appendix. To be fair, she told him. I do not have the exact answer she gave. What Feltar communicated to me was that Veloso's response when he heard it was to sit quietly for a long moment and then say, "We need to talk about what information the compact hasn't been sharing with you," which is a sentence that could go several directions. Feltar did not have the context for which direction it went. I have been thinking about it since. At hour 19 I went to the portside equipment bay. The map overlays were still on the walls. The communication array was quieter now, not 49 channels, something closer to 20, the operational intensity dialing back towards standard. The heating unit in the corner was running. The smell of coffee was present in the way it always was in that room, which was to say present before everything else. Adami was there, alone, sitting on the edge of the briefing table, holding a cup, not drinking from it. Ferrara was visible in the back, working through something at his station with the focused quiet of someone on the other side of an event and not yet done with it. Noak wasn't there. "She's with the endurance crew," Adami said, without looking up. "Two of theirs didn't make it back." I stood for a moment with this. "TBH, I'm sorry," I said, which is a human expression I had been briefed on, the acknowledgement of a loss that can't be practically addressed and which felt in this specific context like the right thing to say rather than a formula. Adami looked up. She was tired in the way that goes past the body into some kind of structural weariness. Not broken. Not even close to broken, which just the quality of someone who has been holding a very large thing for a very long time and has set it down and is feeling now what it weighed. 14 months, she said. That's how long we've been building toward this. She looked at her cup. 19 months if you count the early projections, when the threat modeling started showing patterns that nobody else was responding to. She set the cup down. You spend that long working towards something, and when it's done, she paused, you don't know what to do with your hands. I looked at the map overlays on the walls, the corridors, the positions, the 5 phases that had, against the operational probability distribution that Tath Sorovel's assessment represented, held. Basically, the session, I said, the accusation session, the article citations. I had thought about how to say this for 3 days and still wasn't sure I had the framing right. You sat through 40 minutes of formal charges that you knew were going to resolve in your favor, and the whole time, I stopped. Started again? The whole time you were managing an active operation, 49 channels and the reserve at relay point 7 already in transit, page 13 in the appendix already written. Yeah. You could have told us, I meant the compact, I meant the broader thing which before the session, before the citation, you could have led with the appendix. She looked at me for a long moment. The expression she wore wasn't, for the first time since I had been in this room with her, the kind that was managing something. It was just tired and honest. We tried to tell the coalition about the threat pattern 6 months ago, she said. Filed in sort of assessment through the formal intelligence sharing channel. Flagged it as urgent, she looked at the wall. It went to a review committee, which is the correct process. The review committee requested additional supporting documentation. We submitted it. The committee scheduled a response session. She paused. The response session honestly was scheduled for cycle 19. I thought about the Keth network going active at hour 14 on cycle 9. Cycle 19 was 3 weeks away. I sat down in the chair across from her without being invited, which I recognized even as I did it was a thing she had done to me 3 mornings ago. The process, I said. The process exists for good reasons, she said, and it was the same thing she'd said in my office, and it still had the same quality, not bitterness, not resentment, just the flat acknowledgement of a thing that's true and complicated at the same time. The process is what we built after Dorving. We respect it, which we used it. We submitted through the formal channel, a pause, and then we also built the fleet because we couldn't be sure the process would move faster than the threat. I thought about Article 31.4 be operationally significant composition changes arising from active mission parameters. Thought about Veloso's meeting with Adami and the sentence Feltar had reported, we need to talk about what information the compact hasn't been sharing with you. I thought about the compact, which I had spent 19 years serving, which was built on mutual transparency after a catastrophe that transparency might have prevented, which had a review committee scheduled for cycle 19 that the Keth offensive had made irrelevant. We're going to change the filing procedures, I said. It came out more like a statement than I intended, which meant it was probably more honest than I intended. Probably, she said, kind of, the intelligence sharing channel. The response, honestly, timelines, probably all of it. She picked up her cup, finally drank from it. Plus, to be fair, we'll help if you want. We've been actually thinking about what the structure should look like. A pause. We've been thinking about it for 6 months. Of course they had. I opened my log, hour 19, cycle 10. I started typing and then stopped and looked at the map overlays. The communication array and the heating unit in the corner running and the smell of coffee that was announcement as invitation. I thought about the smile. I thought I understood it better now. Not fully, there was still something in it I couldn't quite pin, a quality I didn't have the right vocabulary for in any language I operated in. The smile basically of someone who had been right about something they hadn't wanted to be right about, who had built a solution to a problem they'd hoped wouldn't materialize, and watched the problem materialize on exactly the timeline they'd projected and had the solution ready. There's probably a word for that in some language somewhere. The specific grief of being correct about a catastrophe and the specific exhaustion of being the one who prevented it. The humans might have a word for it. I'd have to ask. I wrote in my log, the fleet wasn't a rules violation. The fleet was an answer to a question the committee hadn't asked yet. Then I wrote, we need a better question asking process. Then I closed my log and sat in the portside equipment bay that smelled like coffee and looked at the map of the corridors that were clear for the first time in 18 months. Outside, through the station viewport, the void was very quiet. It usually is after